what would happen to him, and he told him to please cut off your sins and be a righteous man. But how was this proud man who had done such a marvellous job in causing this great Babylon to be like it was, he said. And of course, the results of it was that one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, what a place it may have been. But then Daniel is telling him to break off your sins by righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. It may be a lengthening of your tranquility, but all this came upon Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 at the end of 12 months. He walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon, and he's saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honour of the majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, thee spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And here he had grown feathers like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's clay. But at the end of the days, he lifted up his eyes to heaven, and he said, my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honoured him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? This Nebuchadnezzar, his reason returned unto him, and he said, I praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to obey. So Nebuchadnezzar then would give acknowledgement to the God of heaven, and this faithful servant Daniel was able to be placed next to the king during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. But then, of course, we have Nebuchadnezzar dies, and then we have his grandson, finally Belshazzar, who's taken over. And Belshazzar, this evil young king, and how that they had made a feast to 1,000 of his lords, and they brought in all these vessels of the house of the Lord, and being drunk out of them and praising them. And then this handwriting came on the wall, Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. And of course he was so afraid, the joints of his loins were loosed and his knees smote one another. And that is exactly what Isaiah prophesied some 200 years before in Isaiah 45 and 2. Exactly those words about he would loose the loins of kings. And so Daniel was brought in to interpret what this writing was. And that night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, and Daniel was placed over the presidency, was next to this king again. Dear Daniel, who had suffered a lot, who probably may have been such an educated young man, we may think of him as a university student, thinking all were right ahead of him, and then for them to be taken captive. And then Hezekiah was told his descendants, the seed, the royal seed, they would be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And poor Daniel then, not to have the benefit and privilege of a wife or family, was down there. No wonder he was called a dearly beloved man, this man whose heart was turned fully in serving the Lord. No wonder we have the Apostle Paul, man who said he had the right to lead about a wife as Peter and them, but he was a man who was full on for the Lord. What an example we have of these men who refrained, he did, from something that was quite lawful for him. And so we show Daniel there, clothed in scarlet, and the gold chain about his neck, the same as we can look back in history and see what happened to Joseph. Joseph was placed next to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. God has had his people in such high places, but the rest of the people then, they were able to be sent back, because Cyrus then made a decree to send back the people. But what happened to Daniel? Daniel never went back, and he still stayed down there, and because of the jealousy of the Persian people down there, the king ended up having him in the prison, and of course with the den of lions. And so did Daniel, and the king was so upset that he was deceived by the jealousy of those other men under Daniel, that he never slept that night, and he called out in the morning, but Daniel was still alive, and so those evil men were cast in, and the lion had mastery of them. The jealousy of people. How sad. We think of David suffering the jealousy from King Saul, when Saul chased him like a hunted animal, and all because the people gave more credence to David than to Saul himself. Saul has slain his thousands, but they said David has slain his 10,000s, and the effect of jealousy in people's life. But the Lord stood the ground for Daniel, and Daniel, of course, kept his place. But before that exactly took place, it was Cyrus who sent back the people to Jerusalem, those who are minded of their own free will to go back. And of course, that's where we come to that Psalm 126, for we read what it was like for these dear souls, those who were down there, to be able to be sent back, those who wanted to go back. And the psalmist could put it this way: when the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the heathen, the Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, whereof we are glad. So as we learn the scriptures, we learn that there may be failures. There may be, as we have not followed God, and we have not been as we should be, there may be failure, there may be times of drought, as it were, or of captivity. But of course, when people turn around and they're able to put things right, and God has had his way in their life, what a difference God can make. He sent them back, and they've come back to be able to build the temple and to rebuild Jerusalem. And it was as also Daniel. He understood by books in chapter 9 that the captivity would be for 70 years. And how Daniel, in his sincerity, was able to pray for this. He was able to tell God that he's, as well as the people, we've all failed. He made confession. And then in verse 17 he says, now therefore, O our God, hear the prayer of thy servant and his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon the sanctuary that is desolate, for the Lord's sake. And he said, my God, incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and behold our desolations, and the city which is called by thy name, for we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousness, but for thy great mercies. Well, God was certainly moved, for he was having the people go back. And so what a lovely time it was then, an expectation that the people were going back to their beloved city, and they were there, they were prepared to work, they were heading back. And so we can see that at this time, then our next session, we just have a look at how that building progress and what the people had done. We can see on the chart how that these things had taken part, and how that these dear people who've been affected greatly, and then how that God in his mercy was able to intervene in their lives, and to see how God sustained his people. We see even Ezekiel had the visions of God when he was down there amongst the people, and how he would have felt with the people who were down there, and how we experience things that we may understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And so as we look ahead, we see that there is it can be hope in life, that while there's life, there's hope, and God can do his marvellous work that he is able himself to perform. So we may just take that time then to have a look at the next session.